Good Friday morning and welcome to McKenty Live. Welcome indeed to a special edition of McKenty Live. 1 hour this morning, special. How should the French language best be protected in Quebec? And to this special edition, we welcome a special guest, the Minister of Education for Quebec, Mr. Claude Ryan, who is also in charge of the language dossier. It's a long time, Claude, since you and I have been sitting across the table, but we used to do it quite often.
That's right. I'm glad we can resume that long relationship we've had.
I have to tell you that many people in the English community these days come up, say to me, we have a talk about politics, and they say, I'm disappointed in Claude Ryan. I used to consider him an extremely fair man, a man who took into account the rights of minorities. I've lost respect for him. I feel that he's not as fair as he used to be. How do you respond to that?
Well, I've been used to this kind of reaction over the years. If you remember the past, well, think of the October crisis. You remember I was not on the side of official orthodoxy during that situation. I took the side of the people I thought at the time. But most of whatever opinion you heard was on the side of the government. I did not care. I expressed my views, I kept my line, and a year or two after we'd been through that, the people began to say, well, Ryan was not so dumb as he appeared to be. He had his own views, and there was a lot of truth in that. And then you probably remember when Mr. Trudeau decided to patriate the Constitution and impose a new Constitution on Quebec without the participation of the Quebec government and the Quebec National Assembly. I was leader of the opposition at the time, and I induced my party. Well, 9 of my fellow MNA members voted against me on the Liberal side. And then I was strongly criticized by the English press and in English circles. I did not care too much because that's myself with time. You will understand I was sincere, was working for the good of Quebec. But and after a couple of years, well, they said perhaps that wasn't too bad. But you have to go through difficult moments, and during such moments, to express your genuine convictions.
But convictions is the word. I think many in the English community feel that your convictions on language have changed appreciably and have hardened appreciably since you were publisher of Le Devoir.
Look, there was a point at which I had to adapt my views to the political scene in Quebec. I remember we conducted an election campaign in 1981. You probably remember we'd had the referendum campaign before. And during that campaign, I ran into innumerable audiences in different parts of Quebec, at which such questions as these were put to me. Why are you so strongly and so exclusively in favor of Anglophone rights? Why don't you ever talk about Francophone rights? And if you look at the picture in North America, it is France which is in jeopardy, not English. So I came back after the campaign. I reflected during the entire summer. Then I went to the General Council of the party. I remember it was in September 1981. And I told them on 2 issues, the constitutional issue and the language issue, we've got to have a line which will be more palatable to the Francophone majority. The way we're dealing, we will always have the support of the English minority, but we will not have, not the support, you can get it accidentally, but the trust of the Francophone majority. And if we are to get Quebec moving in the direction we want it to go, we have this, of which Francophone consent must be an essential ingredient.
All right.
So that is where I began to adjust my line and thought to myself, you got to think of rights in terms that are applicable, not only in absolute terms.
All right. I want to come back to that and to some other more immediate issues, such as Bill 178 and the teaching or not teaching of French in early grades in schools. But first, we go to this report.
The minister responsible for Quebec's language law this week handed down rules for enforcement of the law applying to posting of signs with English. It is called the 2-for-1 rule, and it means if merchants with 50 or fewer employees want to post bilingual signs, they may do so, but indoors only, and only if the French signs are twice as large or twice as numerous as English signs. French also must be given marked predominance.
I think the rules which we propose in this regulation are flexible. And they leave room for initiative, imagination. And those who want to act in a practical way will know what they have to do if they do not want to be bothered by the government's inspectors.
The regulations would come into effect in 60 days. Although Bill 178 would allow indoor bilingual signs, it upholds a ban on outdoor bilingual signs, which was struck down by the Supreme Court. The opposition rejects the regulations as a linguistic Disneyland, difficult to enforce, and a constitutional nightmare.
I wouldn't like to be an inspector working on that regulation. My God, that will be quite a job.
In his capacity as education minister, Ryan is moving on another Supreme Court decision on education, which says the provincial government, not school board, sets curriculum. Ryan is tightening up enforcement of rules preventing the teaching of English to Quebec students before grade 4.
Premature exposure to English might not be compatible with the best development of the child. There are a lot of other subjects which must be studied in the first years of elementary school too.
This is Howard Schwartz for McKenty Live. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you, Howard. And we welcome your calls on the question, should French be protected in Quebec? 1-800-363-9995. Should French, in your opinion, be protected in Quebec? Claude, the sign situation first. You've said that Bill 178 and the new regulations, which you've just announced this week, are clear and simple. There are a lot of Quebecers, including Anglophones, who think that Bill 101 was far simpler and far clearer than what we've got now.
Well, if they had said so clearly in advance of the legislation which was passed in the National Assembly last December, perhaps the outcome would have been different. But I don't share that interpretation. Under Bill 178, the National Assembly decided that exterior signs would be in French only. They wanted to preserve the French visage of the province of Quebec. And I think that we've been used to it for over 12 years now. It hasn't suppressed anybody's fundamental rights, in spite of what I've heard on these matters.
Well, in spite of what you've heard from your own leader, Mr. Bourassa,
well,
made a statement the only leader in Quebec who's taken away fundamental rights.
I think Mr. Bourassa's words in that particular utterance went beyond what he really thinks. Okay. So I want you to be sure of that. Right. Because if there's a man who's respectful of individual rights in the government, it's Mr. Bourassa. I can assure you of that. But on that occasion, I was sitting beside him, and I realized he had gone beyond what he really thinks. And the position of the government, and my position, is that on the question of exterior signs, fundamental liberties were not involved. The Supreme Court had a different opinion. We have great respect for the Supreme Court, but we had the right to say we disagreed, and we did so in a very, very civilized manner, my way. But Mr. Bourassa insisted that we must take an important step in direction of making more room for the English language in the field of advertising. And he's the one who insisted most strongly that there must be some room for signs in the English language inside stores and businesses employing less than 50 persons.
All right. Now here we now have a formula, a 2-for-1 formula, that some people, including Anglophones, including Parti Québécois people, including Liberals, think is rather ridiculous. Mr. Levesque once said, with regard to Bill 101, I feel humiliated in having to pass this legislation. Do you feel any sense of humiliation about Bill 178?
Not really. Not really. Tell you, we have in the law the concept of marked predominance. It says you may have signs in English inside stores, but there's got to be marked predominance for the French language. So once you've put that into the law, you have to interpret what it means. Are you going to abandon this entirely in the hands of bureaucrats and inspectors who will go about the province deciding by themselves if you have marked preponderance here or not? So we thought there's got to be some guidelines. And the simplest one I could devise, rule of thumb. I don't think there's a clearer, simpler expression of marked predominance than that one. If you go beyond 2-for-1, it is abusive. If you go under 2-for-1, it's not clear, and it lends itself to all kinds of contestation. So we said all those who don't want to suffer embarrassment from government inspectors or bureaucrats will observe that 2-for-1 rule, and there will be no problem.
All right, now the bureaucrats, you want to get away from the bureaucrats, but can't you envisage a kind of a citizens' Gestapo going around Quebec, turning in people who aren't on this 2-for-1?
Look, you've been having this situation for 12 years now. There have been some abuses, not too many on the whole, because these people who go to visit places where complaints have arisen are civilized people. They're taught to behave responsibly, and this instrument will be given to them in order to facilitate the application of the law, not to complicate the lives of people.
Okay.
And my hope is that there will be a diminishing number of complaints, so that someday we can say perhaps we no longer need this kind of apparatus. That will be my dream.
All right. What circumstances do you envisage where the whole trend to language restrictions can be relaxed in Quebec?
Well, I think to the extent that we prove we can observe the law as it now stands, we will prepare public opinion for improvements in the future. We have to give ourselves this mark of reciprocal trust by observing the law. But if the law remains unobserved, as it has been in several places, it makes things more difficult. When I can arise in the House with the assurance that there were no complaints from the Saint Jean-Baptiste Society or ultra-nationalist circles, that the law is perpetually violated in some areas of Montreal, it will make things a lot simpler for me.
Okay.
Then I can say, let's look at potential improvements, because we have shown that we can live together, abide by the same laws and regulations.
Okay.
So that's my purpose, Neil.
Okay. We want to get some calls for the minister, and Hudson, go ahead. You're on with Mr. Ryan.
Okay, Mr. Ryan, I'd like to know why you won't allow English to be taught in grade school. I am an English-speaking Quebecer, and I started in French school in kindergarten. And right now, I can honestly say this is my biggest asset. I'm bilingual now. It did not take away from my English whatsoever, so I cannot see how you can say that teaching English would take away from French. Just does not make sense to me.
Good, clear question. Mr. Ryan.
I must say that I'm all in favor of teaching English as a second language to Francophone students in the province of Quebec. We have much improvement to seek in this area, and I'm going to improve the teaching of English. Now there's a debate about whether it should start in grade 1 or grade 4. The bulk of opinion on the French side is that it should rather start at grade 4. So we've had this system in existence for 11 years, and there is no evidence to suggest that we ought to change that. And you know, we have special problems getting students to master their own mother tongue. So we want to concentrate on that during the first 3 years, primary school, after which there's going to be much more emphasis on the competent teaching of English as a second language.
Now, you have no problem about teaching French in the first grades of English schools.
We have no complaints on this side. You don't have the same problem continent-wise, I would say. Your kids are not exposed to the other language the way our kids are. Don't forget, you look at television. Your kids look at television. They have 3 channels which present programs in French. You have 7 or 8 which present programs in English. You listen to the radio, it's the same. You look all around. Whenever you go outside of Quebec, you're exposed to the English language and culture. So the problem is not the same at all. And if there were representations from English circles that this is detrimental in any way, I would re-examine the situation. But on the French side, there is this permanent fear that it might interfere with the mastery of the French language. And this is supported by the testimony of very, very many educators.
Okay. Do we have time for another call before the break? Yes, Montreal. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I have some comments. Hearing by my accent, you know right away I'm a foreigner. I come from Holland. We have no problems with languages there. I came to England, to Canada. I didn't speak any English. I even managed to go to a university in English. I became a French teacher. In Edmonton, you go into a school, part of the staff room, it's more French than English. The whole
Ma'am, sorry, we do want to get as many calls as we can from Mr. Ryan. What is your question?
The question is, I feel like a displaced person here in Quebec, which I've never had before. My daughter was not allowed to go to school just because I had my education in Holland. Well, I was a Canadian citizen and she is born in Canada.
Your daughter was not allowed to go to an English school?
Right, because of that, and it makes me a displaced person here. And they're only cutting and slicing their own throat by not allowing English in school here when I see these poor little kids here.
Okay, ma'am. Mr. Ryan, restrictions on who can go to what school?
Yes, under Bill 101, as you know, kids whose parents had their primary schooling in English are allowed to go to English school. In addition, under the Canadian Charter of School, can send all their kids to English school. So if your kid went to primary school, grade 1 in Toronto, and you moved to Quebec, all your kids are allowed to go to English school.
Okay, we'll be right back with your questions for Mr. Ryan, the Minister of Education, Minister in charge of the language dossier, right after this short break. Welcome back to McKenty Live, our special edition this morning with the Minister of Education of Quebec, Mr. Claude Ryan. Lines blazing. We'll go right to the calls, but I do have, there's no question, Claude, that your party changed its policy on language since the last election. Why should the English community, why should the English voter listening to us now support the Liberal Party in the next election?
Well, it's true that there was a change in the line of the party as it had been defined before the last election. We cannot deny that. We have to ask ourselves why we were so fast in adopting some resolutions at that convention, from which I was absent, by the way, because it took place the week my wife died, as you probably remember. And there were other resolutions with which I was not in full agreement at the time, but we had to live with them. We realized upon trying to apply it, and I wish to assure you, Mr. Bourassa tried by every means to respect the commitment that had been taken by the party. But the trend of public opinion was too strong. And in order to govern, you have to be able to work on the basis of a consensus. That's the essential art of politics. And we realized together that that consensus which we need in order to govern in a legitimate fashion might be broken if we acted too rapidly in this area, and that was the source of the compromise which arose.
I come back to my question. Why should an English voter support your party?
Because of all the rest that we've been doing to respect the Anglophone community and to make its place safe in Quebec. And I will give you a few examples if you allow me to. In the Department of Education, we created positions for English professionals. There were practically none when I was in opposition. We now have a team of about 20 professionals working in all parts of the province of Quebec, assisting English schools in their educational work. So there's a true place for them within the leading team of the Department of Education. We built Dawson College at corner of Sherbrooke and Atwater at a cost of $50 million. We gave Concordia University about $40 million for building 2 libraries, one on the Concordia campus in the center of Montreal, the other on Loyola campus. We adopted Bill 142, under which the Anglophone community has begun being served in its language in different parts of the province. And Mrs. Robic, which was assigned this particular responsibility by the Premier recently, is working very hard towards establishing programs in each area of the Quebec which will cater to the needs of the Anglophone community. We've done a lot of things in order to improve the lot of English Catholics in our school system. They've often been, long been, the forgotten element in the school system. Go to Laval, for instance. We took special measures in order to see that they would have access to education in their language and in their faith. We could continue.
Okay,
but look at the whole picture.
I'll look at the whole picture, and one of the parts of the picture that I wonder if you can fill in for us this morning is what are you prepared to do about the manifest underfunding of universities in Quebec to bring them up to speed with Ontario? And what do you say about the recommendation that $100 million be increased to universities, of which about $22 million would go to McGill, Concordia, and Bishops?
Where did this scheme originate from, Neil?
Well,
From the Minister of Education and Higher Education. We worked it out in conjunction with the universities concerned. And I think McGill and Concordia and Bishops will attest that they were treated as equal partners at the table around which these matters were discussed. Together, we worked out a program which would bring about much greater equity than we've had in the past 20 years. I made recommendations to Cabinet. I'm not authorized to speak on behalf of the Finance Minister, who will disclose some measures in his forthcoming budget. But the aim is clearly that all universities will be treated on the basis of equality, as all CEGEPs are, and as all school boards are. So we have a record in Quebec of which we can be extremely proud in the area of education. We had this weakness in the area of university funding, but we want to correct it. I'm on record as being strongly in favor of re-establishing equality here.
Okay. And we're going to Montreal West, and you're on with the Minister of Education. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Mr. Ryan, regarding the sign regulation, I hope one day you will come to understand that there are areas not only of the city, but villages in your own riding, Mr. Ryan, in which this sign regulation will never be respected to your satisfaction, simply because the general population and owners find bilingualism, from their point of view, far too desirable, far too profitable. And this two for one will never ever work in little places like Ayrscliff and Knowlton and Stansted Plain and Hatley. And
So the regulations, Mr. Ryan, according to this man, are not going to work, and they're not going to be respected.
Well, I think this is a fairly negative attitude to take at a moment like this. My position is that I'm not aiming at absolute observance of the law within the first year. Let us say we have a percentage of observance at the moment of about 75%. I want to bring it to 78, 80, 85%. And we will keep stressing the educational approach. I want to help form public opinion, to understand what we're trying to do. If we do not have that, the prognosis of our friend will become true and permanent. But I think if we keep working on these matters in a spirit of reciprocal respect, we can make progress. And if we make progress, I don't care about absolute statistics or achievements.
All right.
Okay?
Do we have another call, I think, NDG? No, we don't have time for another call. We'll be right back with a call from NDG after this short break. Welcome back to this extended version of McKenty Live with the Minister of Education of Quebec. I want to remind you, next week, next Wednesday, Germaine Greer, one of the world's leading feminists and writers, will be right here on McKenty Live. Germaine Greer, next Wednesday. Now, NDG, you're on with the Minister of Education. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I'll try and make it as quick as possible. I'm a little concerned about Francophone and Anglophone rights in the way that the education seems to be. They come to Montreal or Quebec because of a lack of English, but my real question is about the sign law. And if I was in Vancouver, Toronto, Los Angeles, New York, anywhere, I could put up a sign in Spanish or Greek or whatever I wanted to, and that would be my right. But here in Quebec, I'm forced to put an outside sign in French. And isn't it up to the Francophone people whether or not they want to patronize my store if I have an English-only sign?
All right, Mr. Ryan, perhaps the latter part of the question.
Look, in all those places which our friend mentioned, there is not an embattled minority like the Francophone minority in Quebec as compared to the rest of North America. And this is the difference. If it were not for these very particular historical circumstances in which the Francophone community of Quebec finds itself, your approach would be right.
I guess one of the more fundamental questions, Claude, is are you really coming to grips with the fundamental problem of the French survival in North America by tinkering around with signs and two-for-one formula? Isn't the real problem the birth rate and
No.
the immigration.
Look, it's not me who's putting emphasis on the signs rules. It is our friends, especially in the Anglophone community. If we decided to observe these very, very simple rules and pass on to other things, I'd be the most relieved of men. But you should see the press. They keep aggressing you all the time. Science, science, science. That's all they talk to you about. We do a lot of things in other areas, never questioned about these things.
Yep.
I don't complain about the press. It's part of the process, and they're probably a true reflection of some feelings that are shared in the community which they serve. But I say, for God's sake, if you don't want to emphasize this too much, let's agree that the 2-for-1 rule is a very simple one, and it needs not endless arguments, because we can't clarify it anyway. There's nothing simpler than that. So let's say, okay, you promise we won't be embarrassed if we abide by that. Let's pass on to something else.
All right, let me put the question another way. There is a growing view among some people, experts and others, that the French it's only a question of time till French is finished in North America anyway.
Well, the Francophones know that, you know. They've lived with this sentiment all their lives. I remember when I was 20 years of age, I used to tell my friends I was not too much of a nationalist at the time. And I used to see the fatality of history hanging over somewhere. But then I resolved myself as a member of that community that I would fight with them in order to preserve their fundamental values as long as history can permit. And we've been doing fairly well on the whole.
All right.
We're a fighting race.
All right.
And I'm proud of it.
Westmount, go ahead, please.
Hello, I'm a bilingual 21-year-old who's been fighting for the bilingual cause for the last 8 years. And obviously, according to Bill 101, Quebec Anglophones are learning French and becoming bilingual, while the Francophones, there tends to be a large sentiment that does not, of Francophones who do not want to learn English. And I would like to ask Mr. Ryan how he feels this will affect Quebec in the long run when the Anglophones are becoming bilingual and a large number of Francophones do not speak English.
Okay, Mr. Ryan.
Well, I must first compliment very numerous Anglophones who have actually become bilingual. I think this is one of the great achievements of the past 10 years. On the French side, I emphasized earlier that I have a job as Minister of Education to see to it that English is learned in a working manner by our kids who are in French schools. We're short of the mark at the moment. There are great deficiencies which have got to be remedied. But I realized upon assuming the portfolio of education, I first had to do something about reinforcing the teaching of French, which is also in very, very poor shape. Now we've launched a very solid program in this area, and I think that starting next year, we can come up with a solid program for the reinforcement of English as second language. And only this is a responsibility which I will not deny and from which I will not shrink.
All right. St. Lambert, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Bonjour, Monsieur Ryan.
Bonjour.
I'm a French-Canadian who has learned English, and I feel that the Francophone rights are best defended across the countries in Ontario, in British Columbia, in Nova Scotia, as well as in Quebec. And I feel that laws such as Bill 101 and Bill 178 do not foster the type of goodwill we need across the country to promote bilingualism.
Okay, the reaction of English Canada.
Well, you probably did not hear about laws which were passed in the past 2 or 3 years in provinces like Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. The Francophone people of Alberta are now before the Supreme Court on the matter of school rights. If they had the kind of laws that we have in Quebec, they would not be before the Supreme Court. They have to go there because their right to have their schools and run them is not accepted by their governments. As simple as that.
No,
and by their provincial parliament.
Mr. Ryan, is this gentleman expressing a view about bilingualism, Mr. Trudeau's view, that we should have a bilingual country in terms of federal institutions? More and more people say that view of Canada is dead. It's finished. Is it your perception that a view of a bilingual Canada is dead?
No, I think you aptly said bilingualism from the standpoint of federal institutions was the main goal of Mr. Trudeau. I think Mr. Trudeau did a great job in this area. And I've seen the enormous progress which was achieved towards this goal in the past 20 years. And I'm far from despairing about the future prospects here. I think we can put up a country with a solidly bilingual federal administration. But in provinces, there will be emphasis on either of the two languages. There's one province which has opted for official bilingualism. No other province has felt able to do so. So you will have priority for one language, for the English language, in most provinces. You've had that for over a century. It will continue. But in Quebec, French will be the predominant language.
Okay.
But we've got to aim to reasonable, fair recognition of English rights.
All right. Joliette, you're on with the Minister of Education. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to address your first question, if we should protect French. From a cultural point of view, my main contact with English culture is through television, and I find that the line between American and Canadian culture is very thin. And sometimes I wonder if the appart of French in Canada doesn't help to give Canada distinct identity.
Mr. Ryan?
Well, your approach is beautiful. I think the survival of French values in the province of Quebec, and also to all the extent it is possible in other parts of Canada, is a considerable contribution to the maintenance of Canada as a distinct society from America. I think it's an essential ingredient. If the French language and culture were to disappear, I would not gamble too much upon the future of Canada as a distinct political society.
Talking about disappearing.
But
if the English community in Quebec disappeared, would French in Quebec be more secure?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think we need the Anglophone community.
For what?
We've had difficult problems in the past few years. I'm proud of McGill University as a Quebecer. I'd like to have an Anglophone university right in the heart of Montreal, which is one of the best in the world, attended by a considerable number of Francophone students. I'm proud of that. I think this is a great opening, an opportunity which very few societies do have. I'm glad that we have Dawson College at corner of Sherbrooke and Atwater, that we have our English language schools all across the province.
We'll come right back to those points right after this short break. Welcome back to this special edition of McKenty Live with the Minister of Education of Quebec, Mr. Claude Ryan. Going right to the caller, Saint Laurent. Go ahead, please.
Hello, I'm bilingual, and I have many French friends, a lot of them professionals, who are obliged to send their children to French school and are not happy with the lack of English in the schools, and they're trying to compensate by sending their children to English functions like brownies or Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, who are looking for English babysitters, Anglophone babysitters, in order to teach their children English.
Mr. Ryan?
Well, that's a fine example for parents to set. I did it with my own kids, and they ended up being all bilingual. So we must not count exclusively on the school to do the job of educating our kids. Parents have a lot of room for initiative, and I think these examples which you mentioned are perfectly legitimate and very interesting.
Okay. Côte St. Luc, go ahead, please.
Hello, Mr. Ryan. Earlier you were talking about Canada as a whole, well, the whole picture. And I think you should look at the whole picture as Canada and it being a bilingual country. Now, I just moved back from Saskatoon. I went to school there for the past 3 years. And what you are doing out here, and I don't think the government realizes it, the backlash throughout the rest of Saskatchewan, the Sask-François are called, they're certainly feeling it. Out in Victoria, the reaction has been very, very negative. They have little pockets where they absolutely refuse to speak any French at all. And I think that you should perhaps think about that. Perhaps some of you travel the rest of the country, west or east, and see what the reaction is in the rest of the country, not just Quebec.
Okay, sir. You've made the point. Mr. Ryan.
Look, we will be strongest, French people in the rest of Canada, to the extent that we are strong in Quebec. History has taught me that lesson. I think it's undeniable. And most of the damage that could have been worked on our Francophone communities outside of Quebec has been affected in the past 100 years. Most of it is beyond repair now. It's terrible to say, but that is the brutal situation.
I think implicit in this gentleman's call, as in others, is the suggestion that a growing number of people in English Canada are saying to Quebec, to hell with it. You're causing so much upset, you're causing so much trouble, to hell with it.
Well, if they want to throw us out of Canada, we can assist them. We can assist them, but I'm sure that is not the true feeling of Canadians. Whenever Quebec is expected to stay in Canada on conditions which are set dictatorially by the rest of Canada, there will be no future for Canada. Let's be under no illusions about this. There's got to be accommodation, understanding between the different communities in Canada, of which Quebec is a leading one, and one which will not be, never accept to be bullied around.
All right. Before we go to the call, on the same point, Mr. Lalonde just said the other day, Meech Lake Accord is dead. How significant for Quebec will that be if in fact it's dead?
Well, I would be profoundly disappointed if Meech Lake were to fail. I stated about a year and a half ago, because I had my own prognosis of what might happen, knowing the rest of Canada pretty well, and English Canada rather well too. Yeah. I had my own intuition that this might not work, and I gave an interview to Le Devoir La Presse, I don't remember, in which I said, if Meech Lake were to fail, that would not be the end of the country. We, people of goodwill, would have to get back to work the very next morning in order to find a compromise which would be acceptable. They would have to climb the mountain again. That's been the history of Canada. And I think we're capable of more efforts in the future. Though I sincerely hope that Meech Lake, being a compromise that had proved acceptable to Quebec, and to all the premiers, and the head of the federal government, only 2 years ago, should still be acceptable.
All right.
They've raised all kinds of fears about the implications of Meech Lake. If you look at it reasonably and coldly, such fears are without foundation, in my view.
Okay. Rosemary, you're on with the Minister of Education.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Ryan.
Bonjour.
It was when I heard of this law restricting the English language, I thought, this is strange. To me, a Department of Education, a Ministère de l'Éducation, has been created to see that everybody in Quebec gets to a certain minimum standard of education in math, in languages, and everything. To my knowledge, this must be the first time that a Department of Education has said you can teach no more than this by restricting the learning of English language, something that the parents want, the students want.
Okay, sir.
No, it's just because you're not informed about what has happened the past 12 years. The present régime pédagogique has been enforced for many, many years, and the provision regarding teaching of English in the first 12 years. And it was not observed in some Protestant school boards who had taken the law into their hands, until the Supreme Court decided recently that the role played by the provincial government in the setting of the curriculum is perfectly legal, perfectly constitutional.
We've gone over that before, and we'll be right back with Mr. Ryan after this short break. Welcome back to McKenty Live. I think for this last segment, we'll take as many calls for the Minister of Education as we can. Point Claire, go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to say I'm a Canadian living in Quebec and not a Quebecer living in Canada. And
your question, sir?
My question is, Mr. Ryan, whatever happened to freedom?
Well, okay,
it's still very much alive, in very good shape in Quebec. I have no problem about that. I think as long as a person like you can make a phone call the way you do it this morning, you can express your views in your newspapers. Your papers are absolutely free to publish whatever they want. Freedom is in good shape.
Okay, sir. Thank you for calling. Hampstead, go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I'm a law student, and I've chosen to go to the University of Ottawa because I wanted to take the national program, the common law and the civil law, and I wanted to take the civil law in French. And I find that now myself and a number of my colleagues feel that there really is not nearly as much opportunity in Quebec as there will be outside of Quebec, economic opportunity. Many of them have chosen to drop out of the civil law program and just pursue a common law degree. And I'd like to know your comment on that, as well as the fact that I have to tell you, I find it quite offensive that you can say that it seems to be your Anglophone friends that are making most of the noise about this problem with the sign issues, and that you would choose not to harp on that, whereas, of course, we have a problem with this, as you're taking away a fundamental freedom of ours. You just said to the last caller that Canada is still a free place because we have our press that we can go and make our comments in. Well, I must tell you that I'm already a little worried about that. What's the next step that this government's going to take? They've already taken away our freedom of...
Okay, sir. I think you've made your point very clearly.
I think your question well exemplifies the kind of legends that are gratuitously built about different issues. At the law school of the University of Montreal, which prepares students for the practice of law, mostly in line with the civil code, you have requests for registration which are about 4 times as big as the number of places that they have. The same applies to Laval University. And these students want to go to those law schools because they feel there's a future there. Of course, it's much harder for a law graduate to find a place for himself on the marketplace today than it would have been 20 years ago when we were short of lawyers. But those who have the talent to make a place for themselves can be confident. I have a son who is a young lawyer. He rapidly found a place for himself. He's doing very well in the practice of his profession right here in Montreal.
But you must view with some sadness and regret the exodus over the years and still of young Anglophones from Quebec who do not think there's a place for them and do not think there's a future for them.
Well, I think if they made their decision to go on that basis, it was because they had been poorly informed about the true situation and prospects here. I have Anglophone colleagues working with me, very close colleagues, who are deeply attached to Quebec, very happy to have a chance to work here and determined to continue. But I think it takes an effort on both sides.
Okay. Lines blazing. Saint Laurent, go ahead, please.
Yeah, how you doing, Neil?
Fine, go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. Ryan. Je suis Canadien-Français, en passant. But I feel it's more of an attack on the English community, the latest laws that have been passed, 101, 178. And we're still the highest taxed province in Canada. And I feel that being these people are attacked, maybe a retaliation should be to stop paying taxes for everybody that speaks English, because we're basically getting no representation and paying taxes anyway.
Well, I'll tell you frankly, I'm scandalized to hear those words. In last year's budget, Mr. Lévesque lowered taxes by $1.3 billion, which brought the level of taxation to the individual taxpayer in Quebec very, very close to the level that you have in Ontario. And I realize this has been completely forgotten or lost sight of. A year after that, well, I want to remind you of those facts.
But
I must remind you of those
taxation.
Facts. You've got to be fair to your government too, eh?
Yes, all right. But
okay.
the taxation and representation, surely another source of regret for you must have been the fact that 3 leading Anglophone ministers felt it necessary to resign from your government on a matter of principle.
That's right. That's right. They did it on the basis of 2 factors, my opinion, their own conviction, and also the pressures which were being applied on them, often blindly, by some people. And I'm glad that they decided, this is not often enough stressed, to remain in the Liberal Party and in the Liberal caucus. They attend our caucus meetings regularly. The 3 of them were at the last meeting that we had this week. They're taking an active part in our discussions. And I think as long as they remain in the Liberal Party and in the Liberal caucus, that tells a lot. You can resign from the government at a question on which you're in disagreement with the government, but the fact that they stay in the Liberal caucus and the Liberal Party is very eloquent as to what they really mean.
We hear now that Mr. Bourassa, the Premier, very much would like to have Mr. Lincoln come back into the government. As a politician, do you see how Mr. Lincoln, under the circumstances, could go back into this government at the present time?
First, I'm not authorized to speak about Mr. Bourassa's intentions as regards the formation of his cabinet. I have no mandate to discuss that, Neil. And as regards Mr. Lincoln, he's a good friend of mine. He's done a very creditable job as a political figure as a Minister of Environment, as a member for Nelligan. I'm the one who recruited him about 9 years ago. I'm proud of his performance. I hope he can stay in the realm of Quebec politics.
Okay. Point Fortune, go ahead, please.
Good morning. I was wondering how far do you think your party is willing to go to promote the French language?
Mr. Ryan?
Well, I think we've indicated our intentions very clearly. I made a speech in the House last week before the parliamentary committee which was studying the budgetary estimates of my department as minister responsible for the application of the Charter of Language, the French language. We intend to promote French as a language of work. We've made progress in this area, but there is still considerable work to be done. We're going to promote the publication. Just to give you another example of the particular situation we have here. Our students in our universities have to work with textbooks, reference books, which are mostly in English. So we have to provide them with minimum material in their language that requires special intervention on the part of government, which would not be justified anywhere else in North America.
Our time's running out. Just a quick question. What is the future of the English community in Quebec in your view?
Well, it's a future they will build for themselves in conjunction with the Francophone majority. As a member of the Francophone community, I'm as deeply disposed as I was 25 years ago to work towards the goal that we've set for ourselves to build a society where we can live together in harmony and amity. I think this is quite possible. At the moment I despair about this, I will no longer be in public life.
So we will be right back with Mr. Ryan after this short break. I want to thank the Minister of Education, a busy man on a busy day, for being the guest of McKenty Live this morning. Thank you, Claude.
Thanks for your hospitality and thanks to all your listeners.
We want to thank the listeners for the calls. We wish you a happy weekend, a pleasant weekend. Monday on McKenty Live, we'll be discussing what we're discussing. And see you Monday at 10.
Neil McKenty's wardrobe provided exclusive by Henry Marks on Drummond Street and Westmount Square. Transportation for McKenty Live provided by Bernard Limousines, 353-5881.